Sometimes the cruelest people laugh the loudest right before their world falls apart. The laughter exploded across the rooftop lounge just as the red soda splashed across Naomi Carter's white blouse. A few drops hit her cheek. The rest rolled slowly down the front of her clothes, dripping onto the polished black tile beneath her heels. For half a second, nobody moved. Then came the laughter. Loud, sharp, careless. Kyle Mercer leaned backward against the marble counter, one hand still holding the empty plastic cup, while the other pointed toward Naomi like she was part of the entertainment. "Oh man," he said between laughs. "I swear I didn't mean to throw the whole thing." But the grin on his face told a different story. Around him, several employees from Whitmore Dynamics covered their mouths, trying not to laugh too hard while others didn't even bother hiding it. Someone near the bar lifted a phone slightly higher. Recording. Naomi stood perfectly still near the edge of the rooftop overlooking downtown Chicago. The wind moved gently through her dark curls while red soda slid slowly from the sleeve of her blouse onto her fingertips. The city lights reflected against the wet fabric, making the stain look darker than it really was. Music still played softly through the rooftop speakers, but suddenly it sounded distant, smaller somehow beneath the noise of humiliation. "Come on," Jessica Hale said with a smirk as she approached, holding a cocktail napkin between two fingers like she didn't want to get too close. "It was just a joke. Don't make it awkward." Naomi accepted the napkin quietly. "A joke," she repeated softly. Her voice wasn't angry. That somehow made the room even crueler. Jessica shrugged. "It's a company mixer. People are having fun." Naomi looked down at the soda dripping onto the floor beside her heels. Then she slowly folded the napkin once in her hand. "Funny," she said calmly. "How humiliation always becomes comedy when the wrong person is suffering." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Kyle laughed louder to fill the silence. "Relax," he said. "Nobody's traumatized over a little cherry soda." Another burst of laughter followed. Naomi didn't respond. She simply bent slightly to pick up the plastic lid that had rolled near her feet. The skyline glowed behind her through the glass railing while cold October winds swept across the rooftop patio, carrying the scent of rain and expensive cologne. Most of the executives ignored her again within seconds, returning to conversations about stock numbers, luxury condos, and weekend trips to Aspen like nothing had happened. Like she wasn't standing there soaked in front of them. Naomi placed the lid quietly onto a nearby table. No yelling, no scene, no tears, and somehow that unsettled a few people more than anger would have. Near the bar, one young intern lowered his phone slowly, shame creeping across his face. But Jessica noticed immediately. "Don't start feeling guilty now," she muttered under her breath. "She's fine." Kyle grabbed another drink from the bartender and shook his head with amusement. "Honestly, I thought she'd loosen up eventually." Naomi turned toward the elevator hallway at the far end of the rooftop. She intended to leave quietly before anyone noticed the trembling in her hands. But just as she took her first step, the elevator doors opened with a soft metallic chime. And suddenly, the entire rooftop fell silent. The silence arrived so fast, it almost felt physical. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Ice clinked softly inside forgotten glasses. Even the music from the rooftop speakers suddenly sounded too cheerful for the tension spreading across the terrace. Naomi Carter turned slowly toward the elevator doors while soda continued dripping from the cuff of her blouse onto the polished floor beneath her. A tall man stepped out of the elevator wearing a charcoal gray overcoat over a black suit, the kind tailored so precisely it looked sharp even under dim rooftop lighting. Ethan Whitmore rarely attended company mixers. Most employees had only seen him through framed magazine covers in conference rooms or quarterly livestream meetings projected across giant screens downstairs. But everyone recognized him instantly. The founder of Whitmore Dynamics carried a presence that did not need introductions. He did not raise his voice. He did not move quickly. Yet the atmosphere shifted around him the moment he stepped onto the rooftop patio. Ethan paused near the elevator entrance, one hand still resting loosely in his coat pocket as his eyes moved across the room. He noticed the nervous expressions first, then the phones disappearing into pockets, then the red soda stain spreading across Naomi's white blouse. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. Jessica straightened immediately, forcing a polished corporate smile onto her face. "Mr. Whitmore," she said brightly, "we did not know you were coming tonight." Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi. Wind brushed gently across the rooftop, lifting a strand of hair near her face while the city skyline flickered behind her like cold silver light. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. But something passed silently between them that nobody else in the room understood. Kyle shifted awkwardly beside the bar and cleared his throat. "It was just office joking around," he muttered, trying to sound casual. Ethan finally looked toward him. Calm. Controlled. Far worse than anger. "Was it?" he asked quietly. Kyle attempted a nervous laugh, but it died halfway out of his mouth. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly, embarrassed now in a completely different way. She hated attention, especially this kind. Ethan walked forward slowly across the rooftop floor, polished dress, shoes moving through scattered reflections of city light and spilled soda. Nobody stepped into his path. Nobody dared speak. Naomi could feel every eye following him as he approached her. The scent of rain drifted through the cold October air, while distant traffic hummed somewhere below the 62nd floor. Ethan stopped directly in front of her. Up close, he noticed the small tremble in her fingers where she still held the folded cocktail napkin. He noticed the stain across her sleeve, the humiliation she was trying so hard not to show on her face. His expression softened for half a second. Only half. Then he removed a crisp, white handkerchief from his coat pocket and held it out toward her carefully. "You are cold," he said softly. The words confused nearly everyone. Standing nearby, not angry, not demanding, concerned. Naomi accepted the handkerchief slowly. "I am fine," she replied quietly, though her voice sounded thinner than before. Ethan glanced down at the red soda dripping near her wrist. Then he looked back toward the employees gathered around the rooftop lounge. The silence became unbearable. Jessica folded her arms tightly, trying to regain control of the moment. "Sir," she began carefully, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." Ethan turned toward her without changing expression. "No," he said calmly. "I understand exactly what happened." And suddenly, for the first time that night, several people in the room realized they might have made a very serious mistake. Jessica Hale forced another smile, but this one looked strained around the edges. The confidence she carried earlier had started slipping beneath the weight of the silence pressing down on the rooftop. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, smoothing the sleeve of her designer blazer. "Everyone here respects Naomi." Kyle was only trying to lighten the mood. Kyle nodded immediately beside the bar. "Exactly. It was harmless." Ethan Whitmore looked at him for several long seconds without speaking. The skyline lights reflected faintly across the glass railing behind him, while cold wind swept through the rooftop patio, rustling cocktail napkins and loose strands of hair. Somewhere near the speakers, a jazz piano track still played softly, awkwardly cheerful against the tension spreading through the room. Ethan finally stepped closer to Naomi again. His eyes dropped briefly toward the stain across her blouse before returning to her face. "Did anyone offer you help?" he asked quietly. Naomi hesitated. She hated moments like this. Public attention always felt heavier when people suddenly decided to care after ignoring cruelty 5 minutes earlier. "I can handle myself," she answered softly. Ethan gave the smallest nod, but his jaw tightened again. Several employees exchanged nervous looks. The younger staff members near the patio doors suddenly seemed fascinated by their untouched drinks. Nobody wanted to be the next person Ethan looked at. Jessica folded her arms. "Tighter. Sir, with respect, this is becoming uncomfortable for everyone." Ethan turned slowly toward her. "Uncomfortable," he repeated. His tone stayed calm, but something underneath it made the word feel sharp. "Interesting choice." Jessica swallowed hard. For years she had built her reputation inside Whitmore Dynamics by controlling rooms exactly like this one. She knew how to flatter executives, how to silence junior staff, how to keep herself untouchable. But standing under Ethan Whitmore's gaze now, she felt strangely exposed. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the city below. 62 floors beneath them, traffic lights glowed red and gold through the rainy Chicago streets. Tiny people moved across crosswalks carrying umbrellas while steam drifted from street vents into the cold night air. The world down there kept moving normally while this rooftop felt frozen in place. Ethan noticed the way Naomi wrapped her fingers around the damp handkerchief he had given her. He remembered those same hands years earlier holding takeout containers in a one-bedroom apartment while he worked 18-hour days trying to keep his first business from collapsing. He remembered her sitting beside him at folding tables covered in unpaid invoices and failed investor pitches. Back then, nobody believed in him except her. Nobody. Sir, Kyle interrupted nervously, trying to recover the room's energy. If Naomi took it personally, then obviously I apologize. But the apology sounded hollow before it even finished leaving his mouth. Naomi glanced briefly toward him, then away again. Ethan heard it too. Empty words. Performed words. The kind people used when consequences suddenly appeared nearby. A cold gust of wind swept across the rooftop, carrying the scent of rainwater and expensive whiskey. One of the decorative candles near the lounge seating flickered violently before going out completely. Ethan slipped one hand into his coat pocket and spoke without raising his voice. You know what disappoints me most? Nobody answered. Not the drink. His eyes moved slowly across the employees standing around the patio. Not even the laughter. The silence deepened. It is how many people stood here watching another human being humiliated and decided protecting their social standing mattered more than doing the right thing. Several faces dropped instantly toward the floor. Near the back of the rooftop, the young intern who had stopped recording earlier looked visibly ashamed now. Jessica tried to speak again, but Ethan raised his hand slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to stop her, and she stopped immediately. Then his eyes returned to Naomi once more, softer this time. You should not have had to stand here alone tonight, he said quietly. The words landed heavier than anger ever could. Naomi Carter inhaled slowly through her nose, steadying herself against the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on her. The rooftop suddenly felt colder than before. Colder than the October wind curling around the glass railings and moving through the scattered lounge chairs. She hated becoming the center of attention, especially this kind of attention. Her blouse still clung damply against her skin where the soda had soaked through the fabric, but she no longer cared about the stain. What exhausted her was the shift in the room. 10 minutes earlier they had laughed at her openly. Now they stood frozen because a powerful man had entered the scene. That hurt more than the prank itself. Ethan remained beside her quietly, one hand resting inside his coat pocket while the other adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with controlled precision. He did not look angry anymore. He looked disappointed. Deeply disappointed, and somehow that expression unsettled everyone far more than shouting ever could. Jessica cleared her throat again, desperate to regain control. Sir, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Ethan looked toward her calmly. Why privately? Jessica blinked. Because this is a company event. Exactly, Ethan replied softly. That is why everyone here should understand what kind of company they work for. The words landed heavily across the rooftop. Near the far end of the patio, two junior employees exchanged nervous glances before quietly lowering their drinks onto a table. Nobody seemed comfortable holding anything anymore. Naomi wrapped Ethan's handkerchief gently around her fingers. The cloth still carried the faint scent of cedarwood and winter cologne. Familiar. Safe. She looked toward Ethan briefly before lowering her voice. You do not need to do this. Ethan turned toward her. Do what? Protect me in front of everyone. A faint sadness crossed his face for half a second. Naomi, he said quietly, you stood beside me when there was nothing to protect. The silence after that sentence felt enormous. Kyle shifted his weight awkwardly near the bar, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. He had spent years building himself into the kind of employee who dominated rooms with jokes and confidence. But now every laugh from earlier echoed back at him differently. Smaller. Meaner. Childish. Jessica folded her arms tighter. Sir, nobody intended actual harm. Ethan looked directly at her. Cruelty rarely announces itself honestly. Wind swept across the rooftop again, colder now, carrying tiny droplets of mist from the approaching rainstorm rolling across downtown Chicago. Far below, headlights streamed across wet streets like rivers of gold beneath the skyscrapers. Naomi stared quietly at the skyline, her expression unreadable. She had learned years ago that dignity sometimes meant surviving humiliation without letting bitterness change who you were. That lesson had cost her enough already. Ethan studied her carefully. He noticed the way she kept pressing her thumb gently against the edge of the handkerchief whenever she felt anxious. The same habit she had during the hardest years of their lives together, back before Whitmore Dynamics occupied 50 floors downtown. back before private drivers and magazine interviews and shareholders. When they shared a tiny apartment over a laundromat on the south side and counted quarters to afford takeout coffee. Nobody on this rooftop knew that version of them existed. To these employees, Naomi was simply a quiet black woman who never bragged, never dressed flashy, never demanded recognition. Easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. Ethan slowly removed his wedding band from beneath the cuff of his glove and turned it once between his fingers. The silver caught the rooftop lights softly. Then, without drama or raised voice, he looked toward the employees gathered around the patio and spoke the sentence that changed everything. "The woman standing beside me," he said calmly, "is not a guest." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Ethan slipped the ring fully onto his finger and continued softly, "She is my wife." The rooftop did not simply go quiet after Ethan Whitmore spoke. It collapsed into silence. The kind of silence so complete people suddenly became aware of tiny sounds they normally ignored. Ice shifting inside glasses. Wind brushing against fabric. The faint hum of traffic 60 stories below. Jessica Hale stared at Naomi Carter as if she had never truly seen her before. Her polished corporate smile vanished completely now, replaced by something rawer. Fear. Beside the bar, Kyle Mercer's face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the rooftop lighting. His hand loosened around his drink until the glass slipped slightly against the marble countertop with a dull clink. Nobody laughed anymore. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention suddenly crashing toward her from every direction. She had never wanted status to define her. That was exactly why so few employees knew who she was. Ethan had offered years ago to place her beside him publicly at every gala, every investor dinner, every magazine cover. She always refused. She preferred quiet rooms, charity work nobody filmed, conversations without cameras, real life, not performance. But tonight, standing beneath cold Chicago wind with soda staining her blouse while employees stared at her in shock, she wondered if staying invisible had allowed too many people to mistake kindness for weakness. "Your wife," Jessica finally whispered, barely able to force the words out. Ethan looked toward her calmly. "For 11 years. The number landed heavily across the rooftop. 11 years. Longer than most executives at Whitmore Dynamics had even worked for the company. Kyle blinked rapidly. "Wait," he muttered under his breath, trying to process everything at once. No, that cannot be right." Ethan turned toward him slowly. "Cannot." Kyle swallowed hard. "I mean, she never said anything." Naomi finally looked up. Her voice remained soft, but steady. Nobody asked. Another painful silence followed. Rain began falling lightly beyond the rooftop glass panels now, tiny droplets catching silver reflections from the city skyline. The jazz music had stopped entirely at some point, though nobody remembered who turned it off. Ethan glanced around the rooftop lounge, taking in every uncomfortable face around him. "Most of you assumed Naomi worked in support staff," he said quietly. Nobody denied it. Some assumed she was a consultant. Jessica's eyes dropped toward the floor. Ethan continued. "A few of you decided she was someone safe to humiliate." His tone never rose. That somehow made every word heavier. Near the patio doors, the young intern who had recorded earlier quietly deleted the video from his phone with trembling fingers. Naomi noticed, but said nothing. Ethan stepped closer beside her again. "Do you know why my wife avoids executive parties?" he asked the room. Nobody answered. "Because she spent years watching powerful people treat kindness like it was weakness." Naomi looked toward him gently. "Ethan." But he shook his head once. Not angry at her. Protective. "No," he said quietly. "Tonight they should hear this." Wind pushed softly through the rooftop again, carrying the scent of rainwater and cold concrete from the streets below. Ethan slipped one hand into his coat pocket while his wedding ring caught the dim rooftop lights. "When Whitmore Dynamics nearly collapsed 12 years ago," he continued, "banks refused to help me. Investors walked away. Friends disappeared." His eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi. Softer now. She stayed. Nobody moved. "Naomi worked double shifts teaching music classes while I slept 3 hours a night trying to save this company." Jessica's expression cracked completely now. The realization settling over her face looked almost painful. Ethan looked across the employees one final time. "So understand something clearly." His voice stayed calm, controlled. Absolute. If you humiliate her, you humiliate the very reason this company still exists. Rain finally began tapping softly against the rooftop glass walls, turning the Chicago skyline beyond them into a blur of silver lights and dark shadows. Nobody seemed interested in the party anymore. Half-empty drinks sat abandoned across marble tables while untouched appetizers cooled beneath decorative candles flickering against the wind. The atmosphere that once felt loud and careless now felt heavy enough to break under its own weight. Naomi Carter stood quietly beside Ethan Whitmore, one hand still wrapped around the damp white handkerchief he had given her earlier. The soda stain remained visible across her blouse, though nobody seemed capable of looking directly at it anymore. Especially not Kyle Mercer. He had retreated slightly from the center of the rooftop, shoulders tense, eyes fixed downward like he hoped the floor might somehow open beneath him and in the nightmare swallowing the evening whole. Jessica Hale looked even worse. Her carefully constructed executive composure had collapsed entirely now. She kept opening her mouth as if searching for the right explanation, then closing it again when none came. Because there was no explanation good enough. Not anymore. Ethan remained calm beside Naomi, but the calmness itself carried weight now. Dangerous weight. The kind built from years of discipline and disappointment rather than temper. He looked across the employees gathered around the rooftop lounge and saw something uncomfortable in many of their faces. Shame. Not because they suddenly discovered morality on their own, but because power had finally entered the room and forced them to confront themselves. That realization saddened him more than it satisfied him. Naomi gently touched his sleeve. "Ethan," she said softly, "that is enough." He turned toward her immediately, the hardness in his expression easing the moment their eyes met. "Enough?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. "I do not want fear to teach this lesson." The wind pushed lightly through the rooftop again, carrying cool rain mist across the patio. Naomi stepped forward slightly, then looked around at the silent employees surrounding them. Her eyes paused briefly on the younger staff. Members first. Nervous faces. Embarrassed faces. People too afraid to speak earlier because they wanted approval more than integrity. Then her gaze shifted toward Kyle. He still could not look directly at her. "Do you know the saddest part?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. It was never about the soda. Her voice stayed calm, gentle even now. It was the laughter afterward. Kyle finally lifted his eyes toward her, guilt visible across his face for the first time all night. Naomi continued softly. "People can recover from embarrassment, but they remember forever who enjoyed watching them suffer." The rooftop remained silent except for rain tapping lightly against glass and distant thunder rolling somewhere beyond the city skyline. Jessica lowered her head slowly. Her expensive earrings caught reflections from the rooftop lights while tears gathered carefully at the corners of her eyes. "Naomi," she whispered weakly, "I truly am sorry." Naomi studied her for several seconds before answering. "I believe you are sorry now." The honesty in her voice hurt more than cruelty would have. Jessica closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of it. Ethan watched Naomi quietly beside him. Even after everything tonight, she still refused bitterness. Still refused humiliation as revenge. That was who she had always been. The strongest person he knew, not because she dominated rooms, but because she never allowed cruelty to reshape her heart. Naomi looked toward the city beyond the rain-covered glass panels. "People think dignity comes from titles," she said softly. "From offices. From money. From who gets invited into certain rooms." She shook her head once. "But dignity is how you treat someone when you believe they have nothing to offer you." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the storm outside seemed quieter somehow. Then Naomi finally looked back toward Ethan, her expression tired but warm beneath the rooftop lights. "Can we go home now?" she asked softly. And for the first time that night, Ethan smiled. The rooftop doors opened softly as Ethan Whitmore and Naomi Carter finally turned to leave, but nobody moved out of habit anymore. Employees stepped aside, almost instinctively now, creating a quiet path between the marble lounge tables and the elevator hallway. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls surrounding the rooftop, turning the city beyond into streaks of silver and gold beneath the storm clouds rolling over Chicago. Naomi walked slowly beside Ethan, one hand lightly holding his arm, while the damp fabric of her blouse clung coldly against her skin. She looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Ethan noticed immediately. He always did. Before they reached the elevator, a voice stopped them. Mrs. Whitmore. Naomi paused gently. The young intern who had recorded earlier stood near the patio entrance, his phone lowered at his side now. He looked barely 22. Nervous. Ashamed. I deleted the video, he said quietly. I should not have filmed any of that. Naomi studied him for a moment beneath the soft rooftop lighting. Then she nodded once. Thank you for realizing it mattered. The young man swallowed hard. I wanted people to laugh at it, he admitted softly. I do not know why. Naomi's expression softened slightly. Because sometimes people are more afraid of being excluded than being cruel. The words hit several others standing nearby, just as hard as they hit him. Ethan remained silent beside her, watching carefully as the room absorbed every sentence. Near the bar, Kyle Mercer finally stepped forward. His movements lacked the careless confidence he carried earlier that night. Even his posture looked smaller somehow. Rainwater reflected dimly across the polished floor beneath his shoes, while thunder rolled softly outside the glass walls. Mrs. Whitmore, he said quietly, struggling through the words, I was wrong. Naomi looked at him calmly. Kyle continued before fear could stop him. Not just tonight. I think I got used to treating people like entertainment. His voice cracked slightly at the end. Jessica closed her eyes briefly nearby, hearing too much truth in that sentence. Kyle looked down at his own hands. You stayed calm while everybody laughed at you. He shook his head once. I could not have done that. Naomi answered softly. You should never have to. Silence. Followed again, but this time it felt different. Less fearful. More honest. Ethan glanced around the rooftop and noticed something changing quietly inside the room. Not reputation. Not power. Perspective. People were beginning to see each other differently now. The way they should have from the beginning. Jessica stepped forward next. Mascara slightly blurred beneath her eyes from tears she clearly hated showing publicly. Naomi, she whispered. I spent years trying to impress powerful people. She looked around the rooftop bitterly. And somehow tonight was the first time I understood what real strength looks like. Naomi said nothing for several seconds. Then she walked slowly toward the nearby marble table where abandoned drinks still sat untouched beneath flickering candlelight. She picked up the empty soda cup Kyle had thrown earlier and placed it carefully into a trash bin nearby. The small action silenced the rooftop all over again. No revenge. No dramatic speech. Just dignity. Ethan watched her with quiet admiration in his eyes. After 11 years together, she still surprised him with the gentleness of her strength. Naomi turned back toward the employees one final time. All of us become someone eventually, she said softly. The question is whether people feel smaller or safer after standing next to us. Rain tapped steadily against the rooftop glass while nobody dared look away from her now. Then Ethan pressed the elevator button quietly beside her. The doors opened with a soft metallic chime, warm golden light spilling into the hallway. Naomi stepped inside first. Ethan followed beside her. And as the elevator doors slowly closed, the last thing the employees saw was not anger on either of their faces. It was grace. The elevator descended in complete silence except for the soft mechanical hum beneath the floor and the distant sound of rain striking the glass exterior of the building. Warm golden light reflected across the brushed steel walls while Naomi Carter stood quietly beside Ethan Whitmore, her fingers still lightly holding the damp handkerchief folded carefully in her hand. For several floors neither of them spoke. The adrenaline from the rooftop had faded now, leaving behind only exhaustion and the strange emotional heaviness that follows humiliation once the audience disappears. Ethan finally looked toward her. You should have told me they were treating you differently. Naomi gave a faint smile without lifting her eyes. Differently, she repeated softly. Ethan, people have treated me differently my entire life. The honesty in her voice settled heavily inside the small elevator. Ethan looked down briefly, jaw tightening again. Even after all these years together, moments like this still reminded him there were wounds money could never erase. The elevator doors opened quietly into the executive lobby on the 48th floor. Most of the building had emptied hours earlier, leaving the marble hallways calm and silent beneath dim evening lights. Rainwater streaked down the giant windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while distant thunder rolled across the skyline. Naomi stepped out first, heels clicking softly against polished stone floors. Ethan followed beside her at an unhurried pace. "You are angry," Naomi said gently after a moment. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "I am disappointed." "At them?" she asked. He shook his head once. "At myself." Naomi stopped walking near the window, overlooking the city streets below. Headlights drifted through the rain like slow rivers of gold between skyscrapers wrapped in fog and storm clouds. "You built a company," she said quietly. "You cannot control every heart inside it." Ethan stepped closer beside her. "Maybe not," he admitted softly. "But I should have noticed sooner." Naomi finally looked at him then. Tired eyes. Kind eyes. The same eyes that sat beside him in hospital waiting rooms when his father died. The same eyes that watched him celebrate his first successful contract inside a tiny apartment kitchen with takeout Chinese food and paper plates because they could not afford furniture yet. "Ethan," she whispered gently, "you did notice." The rain outside intensified slightly, tapping steadily against the enormous glass windows surrounding the executive floor. For a moment, neither moved. Then Naomi reached up and adjusted the slightly crooked collar of his overcoat, an old habit she still did without thinking. Ethan smiled faintly. "Small. Real. You still take care of everyone," he said quietly. Naomi looked down at the handkerchief in her hand. "Someone should." A soft sound behind them interrupted the moment. Ethan turned slightly as the elevator doors opened again at the far end of the lobby. Jessica Hale stepped out slowly, clearly unsure whether she should even be there. Her makeup looked slightly smudged from tears she had tried hard to hide. And for the first time since Naomi had known her, Jessica looked less like a polished executive and more like an ordinary woman carrying genuine regret. She stopped several feet away. "I know I should probably leave you alone," Jessica said quietly. "But if I went home tonight without saying this properly, I do not think I could live with myself." Naomi remained silent, listening. Jessica swallowed hard before continuing. "I spent years believing power meant controlling rooms, controlling people, staying above everyone else." She looked down briefly. "Tonight, I realized I became the exact kind of person I used to fear when I was younger." Ethan watched carefully, but said nothing. This was not his moment anymore. Jessica looked directly at Naomi now. "You had every reason to humiliate us back." Her voice trembled slightly. "But you chose grace instead." Naomi studied her quietly for several seconds. Then she stepped closer and spoke in the gentlest voice Jessica had heard all night. "Grace is not pretending pain did not happen," she said softly. "It is deciding pain will not decide who you become afterward." Jessica lowered her head, tears finally slipping free as silence filled the executive floor once again. An hour later, the storm had settled into a steady midnight rain across downtown Chicago. Most of the lights inside Whitmore Dynamics had gone dark, leaving only scattered office windows glowing against the enormous glass tower rising above the city streets. Far below, traffic moved slower now, tires hissing softly across wet pavement while steam drifted upward from subway grates into the cold night air. Naomi Carter stood alone near the rooftop garden on the private executive terrace, wrapped in one of Ethan Whitmore's dark wool coats. The city stretched endlessly around her, blurred silver and gold beneath the rain-covered skyline. Her damp blouse had finally dried beneath the warmth of the building, but the exhaustion from the evening still lingered quietly inside her chest. Not anger. Something sadder than anger. Ethan stepped onto the terrace, carrying 2 ceramic mugs of tea, the steam curling upward into the cold night air between them. He handed one carefully to Naomi before standing beside her near the railing overlooking the city. For a while, neither spoke. They simply listened to the rain. It tapped softly against the terrace glass panels and collected along the metal railings in tiny shimmering streams beneath the rooftop lights. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed faintly through the sleeping city before disappearing again. Naomi wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Do you remember the apartment on Green Street?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled immediately. "The one with the broken radiator?" She nodded faintly. "And the neighbors who argued every Tuesday night." Ethan laughed softly under his breath. Every Tuesday. The sound warmed the cold air between them. Naomi looked out toward the skyline again. "Back then we had almost nothing." Ethan glanced toward her gently. "We had enough." She smiled faintly at that. Years earlier, they had survived on second-hand furniture, late rent notices, and impossible dreams balanced carefully on hope and stubbornness. But they had also survived with kindness, with patience, with dignity. Tonight reminded Naomi how easy it was for people to lose those things once status entered the room. Ethan leaned lightly against the terrace railing beside her. Human beings reveal themselves in moments when they think nobody important is watching, he said quietly. Naomi looked down into her tea. That is what scares me. Wind moved softly through the terrace garden, rustling the leaves of small potted olive trees lining the stone walkway behind them. Inside the building, the lights on the executive floor dimmed automatically one by one until only the terrace remained illuminated against the stormy night. Ethan reached gently for Naomi's free hand. His thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, slow and familiar. You changed something tonight, he said quietly. Naomi shook her head once. No, they changed themselves. Ethan looked at her carefully. Even after everything, she still refused to place herself above anyone else. That humility was exactly why people underestimated her in the first place. A soft sound behind them interrupted the quiet moment. Ethan glanced back toward the terrace doors and saw Kyle Mercer standing awkwardly near the entrance holding a folded umbrella at his side. He looked uncertain whether he should even approach. Naomi noticed him too. Kyle stepped forward slowly beneath the terrace lights, rainwater still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. I know this probably does not matter tonight, he said quietly. But tomorrow morning, I am resigning. Ethan studied him silently. Kyle looked toward Naomi instead. Not because I got caught, he added quickly. Because I realized I became someone I would not want my little sister working around. Naomi watched him carefully for several seconds. Then she gave the smallest nod. Then maybe tonight was not wasted. Kyle lowered his eyes briefly, emotional in a way he clearly was not used to showing. Then without another word, he turned and quietly disappeared back inside the building. Silence returned once more. Rain continued falling softly across the city while Naomi leaned slightly closer against Ethan's shoulder. Below them, Chicago shimmered beneath storm clouds and streetlights like a living ocean of light. No speeches followed. No dramatic ending. Just two people standing quietly together while the rain washed the city clean around them.